Welcome to the 38th edition of Stump the Pastor. Our question today comes from Paul in Dallas. Here's his question. How do you reconcile a belief in science with a belief in the Bible? And he gives an example. How could Noah build an ark for all the animals and feed them and deal with poop all the time? Well, thanks, Paul, for your great and disgustingly specific question. Last week we dealt with logic in faith, so a question about science in faith makes a good transition. Paul's question is raised in lots of different ways by people of faith, and it leads us back to consider our assumptions about how we interpret our world. As we've noticed before in this series, faith asks questions differently from science. This difference is most notable in questions like Paul's that reveal why we must ask our questions differently. Science, like logic from last week, asks us questions about material, quantities, measurable qualifiers. Faith asks us questions about experience, meaning, and unmeasurable qualifiers. Just as it would be odd for someone to request 2 teaspoons of love, so too, our spiritual questions don't use the same measurement we use for science. So instead of asking how it is possible for the ark to hold all the animals, we might call this the poop perspective. This biblical story is asking us to ponder the meaning of the story. We might call this the ponder perspective. See, the story is about Noah's relationship with God. Noah perceived God's grace in a way that all of his neighbors did not. This faithfulness means Noah would survive a horrible tragedy. The story was also a lesson about the importance of a diverse ecosystem, about caring for the earth, and about trusting grace. Its meaning is that God's grace encompasses the natural world and not just the human world. Now, one of the ways we can tell if a story is about grace instead of a scientific insight is when asking logical questions lead to absurd answers. A logical story would answer questions about space and poop. A spiritual story doesn't address those realities because the story is asking a spiritual question. Now, I know this is hard for us because we have been taught to see the world in atoms and stones and poop. And those questions are the right ones to ask for science. They are not the best questions for faith. See, ancient people used stories to highlight spiritual questions. It was never the question of whether the story was accurate or real. It was a story about an experience. How do we experience God? What does life mean? How do we get along as a community? You see, the answer to these kinds of questions are different from the answers in science class. And one answer doesn't have to be wrong for the other to be right. Here is where ponder questions are just as important as factual questions. A great deal of our world can't be explained with facts. It must be experienced through faith. And we need both. Facts give us information. Faith calls us to experience life. Both realities exist in tandem, and sometimes The answer from one side gives us insight into the other. See, faith calls us to wonder, which often leads to the discovery of new facts. Why do you think we have space exploration? Because people looked up in the sky and saw stars and planets and wondered. How do we know how our brains work now? Because we wonder about that. Pondering new information, how to harness sources of energy. All of these things came out of our wonder, our curiosity. And on the other side, facts help us dispel bad assumptions about our faith, like taking things literally that weren't meant to be taken literally. And I hope that one of the things you have noticed about this series is that some of the best insights come from what stumps us. Unexpected answers should never be the end of the story. And this pastor can testify that some of my best spiritual insights and growth have come from my own experience of being stumped. That's one of the reasons I keep asking all of you to keep stumping me. The other reason is I hope you never quit being curious about the things that stump you. See you next time on Stump the Pastor. Thanks for the question, Paul. It's good to hear from you. Paul's an old friend of mine from my Cathedral of Hope days. So glad to get your questions. If you have some, send them to me. My email address is on the bottom of your screen. Look forward to hearing from you. Next time on Stump the Pastor.